Okay, now that you understood a little bit of the geography and you're still with me, still listening to this, then you are a cinephile. Congratulations. Moving on, let me just give you a high level decade view of the progress of Indian cinema. So, clearly from 1897 or say 1900 to 1940s, largely transitioned from silent movies to the talkies. Right? You will hear one of the great Dada Saheb Phalke. The actual name is Dhundiraj Govind Phalke, uh, as the father of Indian cinema. Was one of, probably safe to say, first set of artists or first artist to probably take cinema very seriously, like really super passionate about it. I'm sure there must have been others which are not recorded in history, but recorded history, his name will probably, you would start there. And uh, and so then you fast forward into the 40s where the cinema emerged. And if you don't know, historically India achieved independence from the British in the year 1947. And so a lot of the cinema was not on, it wasn't big. It was something that used to run as a small section, but it really flourished post, say, 1950s, say 1955, and when India had left the traumas of partition behind, psychologically, emotionally, not like behind, but uh, country was on its way forward, like the first few steps. And so I'd imagine the majority of the movies started to emerge post, or technical maturity, let's put it as well. Stories were always nice, the actors were always very nice, the nuanced, the subtlety, the musicals. And at the time, Hollywood too had musicals, right? It's not that Hollywood abandoned musicals. I think Hollywood stopped musicals post the 70s, right? And so it's fair to say that a lot of the Indian movies could have been influenced or inspired, let's put it this way, inspired by the Western movies. Uh, Not to say that it didn't have its own original content, but there were reflections, especially in the musical. There were inspiration in songs, uh, right from Elvis, Margarita, through George Benson in the 70s, and many other artists, which probably quote unquote inspired. Uh, there was plagiarism as well, downright plagiarism, and we'll come to that later. But in the eras of 50s, 60s, when the movies transitioned from black and white to color, the majority of the storytelling was passive, the forlorn lover, the social drama, the inequalities, injustices, and all that. And it kind of was stereotypical, if you will, to a certain extent. But within those, as is the case in every generation, there are some excellent movies, some not so great movies, and some very terrible movies. So I'd imagine, if you ask the typical Indian, and that itself is a very difficult definition to have, who is a typical Indian. But they would, I think, suffice to say that all agree that the movies made from, say, 40s to 60s were largely good quality movies. Nobody would come back and say, oh, this was a crassy movie. I just hated it. They wouldn't say something on those lines. And then from, and I'm not even getting into the star culture and all those things, that's a separate thing. We're just talking about the history from then to now. And then I think the technology evolution started to kick in. Multicolors, think of Mughal Azam, one of the masterpiece epics and all that. Big, large scale, big mounted sets, great drama. Theater was very prevalent in the 40s, 50s, 60s, all throughout. And people, clearly, theater was not paid as well. It isn't still as well paid as, say, mainstream film industry. So there was this movement between the theatrics, or people from who were pure play theater artists, and they refused to get into cinema. And then those who made that transition into cinema. And so there have been movies made. If you haven't seen Mr. Ray's Nayak, or the hero, literally translated, it's an ode to from theater to cinema. And likewise, and so a lot of the Bengali influence on Hindi cinema is very evident in the 50s, 60s, 70s. A lot of original great content was remade into Hindi because it was assumed that a larger section of the audiences would appreciate that kind of storytelling. And Bengali was not spoken across the length and breadth of the country, but only a certain part of the country. And so 60s and 70s saw a bunch of remakes. A lot of stuff, good stuff was happening in the Tamil industry as well at the time, but lesser number of movies that were remade into Hindi. Mostly was the Bengali, and therefore a lot of the artists, be it music directors, be it actors, technicians, cinematographers, all of them migrated to Bombay and started making Hindi movies. As a result, in some sense, one can argue that the Bengali film industry suffered because of this cultural migration, because the mojo was in Mumbai. Um, and yet, people often ask me that why is that Calcutta never, skyrocketed. There was never a dearth of good actors. You talk about Mr. Shomitra Paul, Mr. Uttam Kumar, character actors like Mr. Kali Banerjee, and a huge list of names as well. Likewise, great film, very nuanced film directors like Ms. Aparna Sen. These people had a very strong cinematic uh, eye, lens, as it were. And though Miss Aparna Sen comes much later in the decades, not in the 50s and the 60s. She's more in the 70s, 80s, and thereabouts. But I'm just giving you a reference to context that there was a lot of brain drain, culture drained into mainstream Hindi cinema. And so we come into the 70s when there was a pivotal turning point where the nice rom-coms took a backseat and action movies took center stage with the advent of a certain gentleman called Mr. Amitabh Bachchan. So that's when the national emotions were evoked. Like if you, Mr. Rajesh Khanna preceded Mr. Amitabh Bachchan as the nice softy, if you will, like nice next door guy, that kind of characters, like with a bunch of romantic tragedies and romantic comedies. He excelled at that, and the stories were very nice, right? Katipatang, Aradhana, uh, Safar Andaz, and many other movies. These were musicals which had drama, romance as the main narrative of the storyline. And this is just Hindi cinema. I'm not referring to any of the southern cinema. Then, like I said, in the 70s, 70, 73, I think, Mr. Amitabh Bachchan kind of, he was a disruptor. He was like completely, it's like, insofar the protagonist would be the guy taking the blow, where Mr. Bachchan's character would come and give back a punch. So he was the Al Pacino of the time, if you will. And not to compare, they hold their own gravitas and right. But again, this is just for reference to context, right? And so, and therefore, it formed a group of Mr. Salim Javed, who used to write these kind of characters, Mr. Prakash Mehra, Mr. Manmohan Desai, the directors, and Mr. Amitabh Bachchan and an ensemble cast, which it became like a cohesive unit, which presented a character which gave back to the society, which punched above their weight. And that kind of set fire to the Indian industry. People just loved it, like, wow, this is what I wanted to say, this is what I wanted to do. And therefore, the journey of Mr. Bachchan becoming iconic probably coincided with the sentiment of the country. So 47 we got independent. In 1970 we had a war in 62, which didn't go down all that well with China at the 65, and then 71 was a decisive war with which liberated Bangladesh, and therefore and defeated Pakistan. And therefore the mood and the sentiment in the country was like, yes, this is the time to give it back, let's do it. And so it kind of coincided with the socio-economic development and growth, coincided with the cinematic representation. The country economically went through ups and downs even post that, but cinematically, Mr. Bachchan really, got the mantle of box office success. He had a stellar run at the box office, say from 1973, starting Zanjeer through to Sholay, through to Diwar, Trishul, and some of Indian cinemas, and this I can say not just Hindi cinemas, Indian cinemas' most memorable performances, because it touched almost, like I said, if there were a billion, there were not a billion people then, but assuming if there were a billion people, it probably touched 999,000, whatever, 999 million people, people's hearts. Like 99% of the people would say, yeah, that is a movie which I loved or have seen. And there are exceptions who did not like it, but that number is very, very small. References like how Scarface changed, say, the action outlook or lens in Hollywood, right? In some sense. And so that is a similar impact probably a Zanjeer or a Sholay had in Indian cinema or Hindi cinema in particular. And then 70s through early 80s, it was all one after the other, one after the other Mr. Bachchan's movies. And that's why he's still regarded as like, you changed my life, you changed the industry, you defined how industry operated. There was this, I will give it back to you, like I mentioned, right? And so many heroes and subgenres and many other protagonists try to emulate the same, and that's probably, you could say, it was there with Mr. Rajesh Khanna, the gentleman preceding Mr. Amitabh Bachchan as the iconic Hindi film hero. But with Mr. Amitabh Bachchan, it kind of, established the star culture that I have arrived, and therefore audiences would say, I will watch a movie for Mr. Amitabh Bachchan, whether there is a story or not, whether there is a plot or not, whether it defied physics or not, whether it made sense or not. That was the magnetism of his personality. And to be fair, it exists till date. He is like transcended generations. And I can go on this, but I'm trying to tell you these are the pivotal moments of the Indian cinema, because it not only had an impact on Hindi cinema, it had an impact on southern cinema, the South Indian and the Eastern cinema, and of course many other global cinema also took notice of Mr. Amitabh Bachchan. And so that journey continued up until 80s, and then through 80s through almost till 2000, like this 20-year phase, arguably was the worst phase of Hindi cinema for sure. And I say that with respect and caution, because it's not that everything was bad, but the number of good movies, proper movies, sensible movies, cinematically, and I'm not saying, one story might appeal to you, the other story might not appeal to somebody else. I'm not speaking of taste and preferences, but the quality of cinema, the artistry levels, that kind of plummeted for some reason. It became more massy, it became more formulaic, it became, the subtlety, undertone was probably lost. So what the Western media largely picked up was largely out of this 80s and 90s Indian cinema, which people hashed and rehashed and churned and rechurned and tried to make repetitive, similar kind of movies over and over again. And there is a context of money and return of investment to that, which I will address in the next segment. But right now, we are just in the history part of it. As to you would ask, right, why did they do that? So that answer is in the next episode. And so right through till all 80s was not a great. So if you pick up cinema, any movies from 80s to 90s, you probably have a handful of 10, 15 movies, given the fact that the country was still producing 1100, 1200 or 1500 movies every single year. The number of movies which were of artistic merit, which raised the level of artistry, were very less. And so that continued up until 90s with the advent of cable television. That in 1992 the economy opened up, and we got to see global content for the first time. And that's when things started to change. And I'll address this in the next part.